the Celestials. But during the war between the Aspirants and the Celestials themselves, the Aspirants had developed the God Killer armor that stands 25,000 feet tall. And this God Killer armor served the purpose of basically destroying Celestials. And the war was massive. It was a universe-wide war. Now, what we learned in Ultimates is that this conflict is simply the 7th time it's happened. That back in the beginning of all things, when the very first universe came into existence, that universe was basically called the Firmament. And that universe created Aspirants and it created Celestials. Both of these beings were designed to basically view the first Firmament as being, kind of like an all-encompassing entity. That is to say, they basically worship. The problem is that some of these beings, namely the Celestials, began to operate with autonomy, which is to say they basically broke away from the influence of the first Firmament and became their own beings. And so because of this, the war between the Celestials and the Aspirants was actually a war between those who were loyal to the first Firmament and those who were not. And so because of this, the Celestials basically won. The first Firmament was pushed to the brink of all existence, and the cycle repeated itself. Only thing you gotta do,
so when you see the message, go to it, click on it, and you should be in the room.
All over again. The exception to this is that the first Firmament existed outside of all space and time, and outside of the main universe itself, and just watch the multiverse collapse and be reborn 6 or 7 times, leading up to the formation of the all-new, all-different Marvel universe, following the events of Secret Wars. And so, of course, what we find out is that with Tony Stark being here, with Reporter 451 still maintaining control of the suit of armor, what happened is that when Reporter 451 went to the body, let Tony Stark there, and then stole
and if you don't build them up, you ain't gonna never be able to play with nobody online really like that. Because you're gonna be too weak and you ain't gonna be able to play the numbers that everybody else play.
Engineered Tony Stark so that he and he alone could pilot the God Killer armor and station it on planet Earth and become essentially a warning to anybody who shows up.
Everybody that got these games, all of their characters power level 140. So if you ain't in the hundreds, your character is weak.
I mean, it's just ridiculous. Of course, in the middle of all this, we're met by the arrival of Death's Head.
At least 50. Your character be 50, they be alright.
451 trying to wrap up all
other than that,
Death's Head is, for all intents and purposes, the best in the entire Marvel universe. And
he might be.
Him being as capable as he is, but
all in all,
put a bounty on his head. And so this really kind of shows us the arrogance and the hubris of the Reporter to basically try to eliminate the greatest
build him up, make him stronger
by sending other bounty hunters after him. And so again, what this does is because of the fact that Death's Head is just a giant machine, the Reporter hacks into him and essentially shuts him down. Really just kind of makes him into his own personal slave. And so again, the commands that have been given to these individuals that the Reporter hacks into, namely the suit of Iron Man and Death's Head, is do not allow me to be harmed, do not harm me, and carry out my orders. Now, they're given free will to do anything they want to, but if Tony Stark tried to kill Reporter 451, the suit wouldn't let him. If Death's Head tried to kill Reporter 451, his body wouldn't let him, but he still maintains his own mind, he still maintains his own intelligence and his own thoughts and desires, and even free speech. He just can't kill Reporter 451 and has to follow all of his orders. And so because of this, Tony Stark's required to think fast. Now, because of the fact that the suit itself responds to Tony Stark as much as it responds to Pepper Potts, it's really kind of like a redundant system. If the Pepper AI essentially becomes corrupted, Tony Stark can basically purge it and then operate the suit on his own. And that's exactly what he does. Of course, the Pepper AI pretty much kind of goes with this idea as well because it's the only way to save what it is that's happening. But Stark essentially shuts down the suit and then just runs, and that's it. So at this point, he's really just kind of stuck on his feet. But the funny thing about this is that when Death's Head had shown up and had basically fought on behalf of Tony Stark even for only a moment, he made reference to the fact that Tony Stark's own weapon systems had followed him there. Now, the reason why was because with the Pepper AI basically taken over by Reporter 451, the AI was still able to function and use all of its normal resources. And so what it basically did is it realized if Reporter 451 hacked into me, then I can basically recall all the armors of Tony Stark when it doesn't realize what's going on. And Tony Stark can basically just jury-rig the armor so that they can work without having to worry about, Reporter 451 hacking into them. And that's exactly what he does. He basically begins grabbing all these different suits of armor to essentially wire them all together as a dummy system so Reporter 451 can't use it. But the fact remains that with regards to Death's Head, because it's essentially acting to try to destroy Reporter 451, it essentially acts around the parameters. Then it basically just kind of takes 451 and just dives off the side of one of the ledges, hoping that it'll destroy Reporter 451 at the same time, because when they hit the bottom of the God Killer armor, they'll have been traveling almost 5 miles because of how tall it is. Of course, Reporter 451 says of a handmaid, and that's that. That's the end of Death's Head. But again, what this does is it shows us the intelligence and the ingenuity of Tony Stark, but it's also this idea that not everything is what it seems. And the reason why is because Kieran Gillen is hinting at the idea that either something went wrong with the plan of Reporter 451 or Tony Stark is not the child of Howard and Maria. And the reason why is because of the fact that the child of Howard and Maria was programmed to be able to access and to pilot the God Killer armor. When Reporter 451 sends the God Killer armor careening into a planet, hoping that Tony Stark will seize control of his pilot, merge with the armor, and then deploy it away from the planet itself, Stark tries it and can't control the suit. He cannot control the ship. And so because of this, the indication here from Kieran Gillen is that Tony Stark is not the biological child of Howard and Maria. Now this is really interesting because when this first dropped, it was the talk of the town. Tony Stark is not the child of Howard and Maria? That's crazy. But the fact remains here that with Tony Stark unable to pilot the suit of armor, ultimately it ends up destroying the planet. Now again, this is where the whole views and the whole perspectives begin to shift. And the reason why is because of the fact that from the perspective of Reporter 451, Tony Stark did not stop the God Killer armor from crashing into the planet because he chose not to, not because he couldn't. And so again, this is really kind of interesting because it makes Recorder 451 very human in the sense that he's just kind of ignoring facts in place of what he believes to be true. Because in truth, he doesn't know what's going on. It also shows us how durable and how strong the recorders are. I mean, they're nigh unstoppable just in terms of the physical structure, in terms of the durability. Now, there's all different kinds of things that he can do, but ultimately, alongside the assistance of Pepper, the hacking system of Recorder 451 is destroyed, which in turn frees her from his control and really just kind of sets the stage for the recorder system to be almost completely obliterated. Now, before this happens, Tony Stark actually grabs the recorder, drags him over to one of the interface devices, and forces the recorder to bear witness to the fact that Tony Stark cannot control it. Like, you couldn't tell him the truth, you had to make him see the truth. With the recorder basically realizing that Tony Stark is not the child of Howard and Maria, the question becomes, then who is? Who is the child of Howard and Maria? Now, at this point for the recorder, it doesn't matter. I mean, his life is basically done. I mean, it's really just kind of over. And so because of the fact that he says, look, I acted in what I thought was the best interest, only for me to find out that I basically screwed up. My purpose is null. It essentially just kind of deletes itself. And so because of that, Tony Stark really has no way out. I mean, the doors are sealed, sure, the God Killer armor is sent away from the planet Earth, but it's also told by the recorder to begin the process of jumping to another dimension, to jump to another reality, and it'll take Tony Stark with it, and Stark's not able to get out. And so again, building on this intelligence of Tony Stark, of course, he ends up grabbing the recorder and then hooking up his hacking system and breaking himself free. That's really it. He just kind of gets him out as fast as he possibly can, and then they basically just bail out. But something else that I also want you to notice here is the idea of a Dyson sphere. When the God Killer armor was first introduced as part of this story, it was basically hidden away from all things in existence inside of a Dyson sphere. Of course, the Dyson sphere serving the purpose, or serving multiple purposes, of being able to like absorb solar energy, absorb a star, that kind of thing. But it was designed for the purpose of keeping the God Killer armor hidden. The reason why this matters is because this is yet another instance when Hickman will reach into existing stories from the Iron Man comics and the Captain America comics and so on, and roll them over into incursions and everything. When the Infinity Gauntlet, when the gems shattered and they weren't able to use the gauntlet anymore, Tony Stark decided to build a Dyson sphere around the sun and then channel the energies of the sun to destroy incursing planets. So again, it was really kind of a cool idea in terms of how it all just kind of reaches together and how it all kind of comes back in. But what we end up having here is Tony Stark arriving back on Earth, only to find out that where he had basically taken off before his birthday, she essentially just kind of held his birthday celebration off until he got back. And then it's the Avengers and everything. But the important thing here is that Tony Stark begins to remember what it was that went on with regards to Recorder 451. The idea that the programmed child of Howard and Maria Stark was made for the purpose of being able to access the God Killer armor. The fact that Tony Stark wasn't able to do that meant that he was not the biological child of Howard and Maria Stark. Now, the reason why he comes to this conclusion is because of the fact that recorders are robots. They're not designed to be human. They're not designed to make mistakes. In this instance, with everything that it was that Recorder 451 had done, there was no reason to indicate that it was wrong about the idea that only Howard and Maria's child should be able to access the God Killer armor. And so after going through all this documentation and going through all this different paperwork, Tony Stark comes to the only logical conclusion that he can, that Howard and Maria Stark do have a child, and that child is not him. And so what we do is we jump back to the initial scenario when Recorder 451 appeared to Howard and Maria Stark and offer the option of allowing them to have a child, and stating that there would be some genetic genetic modifications that would be made to it. And in this discussion between the two of them, they effectively just wrote notes to one another asking the question, can it be trusted? Do you believe that it has our best interests and hearts? And so again, it really showed the idea that from the very beginning, Howard and Maria Stark did not trust Recorder 451. Now, ultimately, they ended up going through with it. The change to the plan came by way of Howard Stark himself. And again, this shows us just how smart he is. And so what we end up finding out here is that when Maria Stark was impregnated with a child, and then Recorder 451 began the process of genetically modifying that child, Howard began to go through with all the notes that he was given by Recorder 451 and began meddling around and investigating in terms of what was happening, and found a hidden line of code that was basically designed for the purpose of killing the child of Howard and Maria Stark when it was around 30, when it was in his 30s, maybe close to 40. And so it was basically a suicide gene. Now, we know by virtue of reading the story, the gene was created by Recorder 451 so that it would be able to grab the child of Howard and Maria Stark, whisk it off to the God Killer armor, make it part of the God Killer armor, presumably infusing its mind with the armor itself, making it a pilot, and then its physical body would just shut down, so there would be nothing left but the mind stuck inside the God Killer armor. What Howard did is he basically created a serum of sorts that would disrupt this gene. Now, the crazy thing about this is he does not tell his wife. He does not tell Maria Stark about what's going on, but it's not because he doesn't trust her. He does it because of the fact that Recorder 451 kept extremely close tabs on Maria Stark, because of the fact that the future of all the Recorder's plans hinged on this child being born happy and healthy. And so what ends up happening here is that when the baby's born, it shows some struggling, it shows some wheeziness, and it's effectively born with cellular degeneration. And this is when Howard Stark says, I found a weird kind of scenario, a weird line of code inside this kid's genes. I tried to find a way to neutralize it, and instead, I basically incapacitated our child. Their mind will stay intact, but they'll never be able to use their physical body. The other half of this is that if Recorder 451 never found out about this, it would likely kill Howard and Maria Stark and start over again with somebody else, presumably somebody a little more naive that can't quite investigate on the same level that Howard Stark did. And so in order to maintain their position in terms of keeping everything under wraps, what they ended up doing is they took their biological child, Arno Stark, they put him in their own little hospice of sorts, and then in turn, they adopted Tony Stark to keep their cover, to make it look like everything was going along as planned. And so the implication here is that Tony Stark is just as smart as he is because he's just that damn smart, because he's just that intelligent. But putting two and two together, for the first time in his life, he encounters his brother, Arno Stark. And this is so cool because Arno's first really statement to him is, just so you know, I would have worked it out like a decade ago. And so for the most part, they get on with a pretty good start. Now, of course, a lot of this seems to be because of the fact that Arno's quite aware that Tony Stark was never told about what was going on. So he's coming into this completely blind. Stark never knew about what was happening. And so the result of this is that with these two brothers being extremely intelligent, then the question becomes, if this is what Tony Stark was able to do in isolation, and he does not seem to have the intelligence that his brother has in terms of being so capable, what in the world could they possibly do together? And so what this does is this sets the stage for the next story by Kieran Gillen called Iron Metropolitan. So getting into the Iron Metropolitan, what I want to do before we start this is I want to run over the 10 rings of the Mandarin. And the reason why is because of the fact that what Kieran Gillen is going to do is basically turn the rings of the Mandarin into the equivalent of lantern rings in Marvel Comics. Now the reason why I say this is because of the fact that the rings themselves are actually going to start seeking out people in this particular story and going into the rings of the Mandarin. And the lantern rings in DC Comics serve the same purpose. You have the ability to instill great health, that's the blue lantern rings. You have the ability to instill great fear, that's the celestial core rings. Because of that, it's really one of these scenarios where Marvel's just kind of borrowing from DC, but it's done in a way that still works. Now, with regards to the rings of the Mandarin, there are 10 of them, and each of the rings has its own distinct property or ability that makes it separate from any of the other rings. Now, in truth, I compared all the information from the Marvel Wiki to the comics, so the Marvel Wiki's actually right this time. And so we're just going to kind of go with the list that they have there. But the Remaker is basically a ring that allows the Mandarin to manipulate the atomic and molecular structure of matter, but it cannot transmute elements or affect objects encased in force or energy fields, meaning it cannot turn something into gold. And if something's behind a force field, they can't do anything to access it. The Influence Ring allows the Mandarin to generate and project various beams of concussive force. Pretty straightforward. The Spin Ring causes the air to move about at high speeds like if we're in a vortex, and the vortex can be used as an offensive weapon, as a means of levitating objects, or as a means of propelling propelling the ring's wearer through the air, basically giving them the power of flight. The spectral ring allows the Mandarin to project a beam of energy capable of destroying the bonds between the atoms and molecules of any particular object, causing inanimate objects to disintegrate. The problem with this is the ring has to recharge for 20 minutes after each use. Of course, this is basically a caveat that allows Marvel to keep the Mandarin from being a guy who can just manipulate matter on the atomic scale anytime he wants to. Now, the Nightbringer ring allows the Mandarin to create an area of darkness, presumably using Dark Force energy to do so. Now, Dark Force energy is almost like Vanta Black in a lot of different ways. Those of you guys who don't know what that is, Vanta Black is a shade of black that's so incredibly dark that anything that's sprayed with the color Vanta Black basically just looks like a hole in reality. It's crazy how dark it is. Like, there's one image circulating out there somewhere of a basketball that was sprayed with Vanta Black, and it looks like it's just a hole in reality. It's crazy how it looks like. It's really kind of mind-blowing. But for those of you guys who are reading Secret Empire, Dark Force energy is what was used to basically encase all of New York so that Doctor Strange and everybody was just kind of trapped in another dimension. So again, it's really one of these things where it just harnesses other dimensional power. But the Daemonic ring allows the Mandarin to generate and manipulate various forms of electromagnetic energy. The Incandescence ring allows the Mandarin to project blasts of infrared and produce flame or ignite combustible material. The Lyre, which is actually going to be one of the more interesting rings in the story, magnifies the Mandarin's psionic energies, allowing him to mentally manipulate the thoughts and actions of others. And we'll actually hint on how that was used by the Mandarin himself here in a little bit. The Lightning ring allows the Mandarin to project blasts of electrical energy. It literally does exactly what it sounds like. It generates lightning. The Zero ring allows the Mandarin to project waves of intense cold and ice, including trapping foes in ice blocks and sheets. So it basically just kind of allows the Mandarin to manipulate cold weather. That's really it. It kind of like gives them the power of Iceman in a lot of different ways. Now, having run over that list real quick, the whole basis behind the idea of really Iron Metropolitan is to show us what the potential could possibly be with the Arno and Stark brothers. Remember, of course, in the last video we talked about how Tony Stark had learned about his brother Arno, basically the genetically engineered brother that's the biological child of Howard and Maria Stark, and that Tony himself was basically just adopted. So again, this is really kind of cool because it served two purposes. The first was creating a more compelling story, and the second was actually bringing to us the idea that Tony Stark is as smart as he is because he's just that smart. It's just genuine natural intelligence. So again, it's kind of a cool scenario. But with regards to the future that really beholds the Earth for these two guys, remember, Tony Stark was basically told by Reporter 451 prior to its death, more or less, that the Earth was a potential beacon for peace across the universe. And we know, just by virtue of Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, that time will eventually come. Something like 10,000 years in the future, 5,000 years, I don't remember what it is, but there's actually a place called Avengers World. But with regards to getting to that place, what we end up having is really like this glimpse 30 years in the future, where Tony Stark and Arno have basically generated peace across the planet Earth. They have this massive city called Troy, and this city basically creates pure energy for the world to use. It really creates a kind of utopia. The downside of this is that they currently have an AI called Helen, and Helen is modeled largely after Recorder 451, but as Tony Stark puts it, was designed to basically stay away from all the glitches and the mistakes that will come along with artificial intelligence. Of course, this turns out not to be the case. Helen goes awry and begins the process of tearing up everything that Tony Stark and Arno Stark have built. Now, of course, in response to this, they end up sending out, some 20,000 Iron Man suits that are piloted by AIs, modeled after Pepper Potts, after James Rhodes, but in the end, it doesn't make any difference. Everything they've worked for has been destroyed. So what we end up learning is that this is actually a simulation that both Arno Stark and Tony Stark are experiencing, and in every single instance of this simulation, the AI Helen that they create ultimately goes awry. Now, the reason why this is important is because Tony and Arno take two different stances on this. Arno's response is, you cannot toy with AI. Every single simulation we've run, the AI will always become sentient and it will always run amok. In Tony Stark's mind, there's going to be a way around it. There's got to be a way to basically set up that AI so it will not go down that path. It will not become a villain, more or less. So again, it's really kind of wild because we learned that Tony Stark had basically brought, Recorder 451 back to Earth for the purpose of really doing nothing more than just kind of experimenting on and learning about the technology that it has. Because remember, with that recorder having been around for millions of years, it assimilated all different kinds of technology from across the universe, technology that humanity hasn't even experienced yet. The only way to access it is in Recorder 451. So again, Tony Stark basically has preview to technology and advances that humanity would otherwise never have access to. But at the end of the day, his mind is still that they can create this utopia for the world, and they can literally transform Earth into a beacon of peace across the universe. But the first step is finding a way to salvage and to access all the technology within, Recorder 451 and basically save Earth itself. And so from here, this is when we begin the process of switching over to the idea of essentially Marvel's version of the Green Lantern race, in the sense that one of the...
Excuse me, there is a message for you.
By the name of Abigail Beryl Burns, who really goes by the name Red Peril, essentially, as she puts it. She's really more of like a journalist, where she goes through and writes about corporations that engage in CD activism and things like that. But she's really just kind of pissed off at the world, and she hates capitalism and different things like that. And so the result is that she's given a ring, and she's deemed to be Mandarin 7. And the idea is to essentially take revenge against Tony Stark. Now, we don't really know why. We don't know why these rings are taking revenge against Tony Stark, and in fact, the rings have never become sentient before. The rings are only ever objects that were used by the Mandarin to basically fight against Tony Stark. So this is wholly new. This is brand new stuff by Kieran Gillen, and it's actually really kind of cool to see it all unfold. But what we also end up finding out here is the first stage to Tony Stark's plan of basically revamping the world is traveling to Mandarin City. Now, this is kind of interesting, because when Matt Fraction first introduced Mandarin City, there wasn't really a whole lot to go on there. It was just